A few weeks ago, I received a package in the mail. A single videotape. The footage was grainy and the tape skipped about every 7 seconds, but I could still see the old man on the screen. The timestamp read August 5th, 1998, and I could hear it very clearly when he spoke. Congratulations! You've been cordially invited to the last unwrapping party on Earth. The old man, wide-lensed glasses, and large gray mustache obscuring a large portion of his withered face, pitched his story quite plainly. In the 1800s, Egyptomania gripped this great country. Egyptian culture was celebrated, appropriated, exploited until there was nothing left. Treasures that were excavated were sold for profit. Tombs were pillaged into oblivion, and bodies were ground up into all sorts of things. Paint, face cream, even edible powder. At this, he paused and shook his head sadly. Such a shame. Then he cleared his throat and straightened up. I, Regis Hannigan, consider myself to be somewhat of a philanthropist, as anyone with more wealth than they need should be. A preserver of culture, if you will. He chuckled. Static filtered in from the speakers as he enjoyed some private joke. So this is my gift, a final gift, for the beloved land of the living. After my departure from your company, he smiled. As you all know, as a member of my family, that upon my death, my estate is to remain in the custody of my trust holder. Then, once 25 years have passed, my will be read, and inheritance will be distributed. He smiled even wider. And all at an unwrapping party, just like in the old days. A chance for you people of the future to witness an actual opening of the crypt and the unveiling of the treasures within. The original time capsule. How I envy you. He chuckled again before looking at the camera in such a knowing way that it made me uncomfortable. As I gazed at him upon the screen, he too looked back. And best of all, I've secured a real, authentically embalmed mummy to be unwrapped for your enjoyment. Me. My name is Samuel Singer, and I wish things like this didn't always seem to happen to me. Better yet, I wish I could learn to look into the mysterious and the strange and find it within myself to say no, but there I was. Standing amongst strangers in the parlor of an old Victorian home, watching the way the candlelit flickered off the polished surface of the solid gold sarcophagus in the center of the room. There were drinks in one corner, old brandy wines in crystal goblets and crumbly biscuits. The parlor was small and intimate, and the few guests that had received an invitation like I had were milling around, chatting idly and waiting for the main event to begin. I was standing, alone, in front of an unlit fireplace, cupping a drink I didn't trust enough to sip, wondering why on earth I had come to an occasion like this. This is so strange, right? I jumped slightly as a voice spoke next to me. I turned to see a young man, tall and gaunt. Though most everyone else had dressed up for the occasion, he wore black jeans and a black t-shirt. His eyes had dark circles around the bottom and red around the rims, and I immediately had the impression that he was under the influence of more than just the wine in his cup. He was scanning the room, settling on no one in particular. It is, yeah, I answered politely. My mummy's the great uncle, he said, and then immediately let out a cackling laugh. I mean my great uncle's the mummy, he corrected, gesturing with his drink to the sarcophagus. Yeah, he absolutely hated me, and my deadbeat father. I have not the faintest idea why I'm here. I give a small, nervous laugh. Yeah, I don't either. I didn't even know the man. He grinned widely at me. I envy you. He took a sip of his drink. From what I remember, throwing a party for greedy strangers to see his embalmed corpse in exchange for an inheritance is Very on brand with dear old Uncle Regis. He gazed at me a moment more before sticking out his hand. My name's Ander Hannigan. I took his hand. Sam Singer. I'm a reporter for the Habitsville Gazette. I'm not sure why, but I got an invite. Ander snorted. Makes sense. Uncle Regis probably wants to make as big a spectacle as he can out of this. He looked around in silence for a while. I took note of who else was here. A stern older woman, her hair tied back tight in an ironed gingham dress. A well-to-do looking pair, a man and a woman, looking to be in their early 30s, wearing matching khakis and sweaters. Despite the July heat, speaking to the matching couple was an older man, short and round, with a twisted mustache and a pocket watch hanging from his vest. And all the way across the room, examining the many paintings that hung from the walls, was a girl, no older than 17, holding a glass of brandy and not speaking to anyone. I could see that her eyes were aimed at the art in front of her, but I could tell her mind was somewhere else. So, why'd you come? I suddenly asked Ander, trying not to make it too obvious that my motivation for asking the question was an urge to investigate, not just friendly curiosity. I mean, since you agree this is bizarre, and you aren't close with the man. That's the question, isn't it? He said with a wink. I'm here for the same thing as everyone else. I want a piece of the pie. Uncle Reggie didn't like me, but he hated my deadbeat father. I'm hoping he just skipped over that loser and given the estate to me. I looked around, my eyes lingering on the man with the pocket watch. And your dad isn't here, is he? No, of course not, Ander said with a hint of bitterness. I haven't seen him in about 10 years. Abandoning piece of trash that he is. Probably wasn't even invited, which is great for me. He snickered at the thought. Then he idly waved his hand to the young girl gazing at the paintings. That's my competition. The others, they're fooling themselves if they think Uncle Regis left them anything of actual value. I furrowed my brow at the girl. Who's that? That's Wendy. She's my great-uncle's grandniece. Never actually met her in person, but I'm already pretty pissed with her. He shook his head. Takes a lot of nerve to compete for the estate of a man who died before you were born. But I heard that Uncle Regis really loved her mother, so as her next of kin, she's invited. He looked at a large hanging antique clock on the wall. Wonder when Willie's getting here. I watched the girl for a bit longer. While everyone else was chatting like they knew one another, she continued to stand, sullen and alone. And who's Willie? I asked casually. Oh, there he is, Anders said. He motioned to a clean-cut man in his 60s who had just entered from the far side of the parlor holding a briefcase. Uncle Regis's apprentice, Andy answered with a scoff. Looks normal, but don't let that fool you. He's the one who's held on to Uncle Reggie's stuff until it was ready to be passed on. He looked around at all the ornaments that had lined the walls and the antique furniture that lay around the room. And he never touched a single thing in this house, he said, with a shake of his head. You can bet if I get a hold of this stuff, it'll be gone like that, he said, snapping his fingers, chuckling, and took another long sip of brandy. I did the same. He's also the guy who embalmed my uncle. I coughed out the drink I had just put in my lips. What? They're obsessed with all this Egyptomania crap, Anders said dismissively. Willie's been hanging around him since he was a kid. Then he became like a scientist or a doctor or something. So Uncle Regis had him do it. But, I started. Shh. Ander waved me to quiet. Looks like Willie's about to start. The man with the briefcase had set it on a table next to the sarcophagus and unpacked some unfamiliar instruments. Huge hooks and straps, brushes, and a pair of heavy leather gloves. Welcome, he said, and the chatter in the room died down as their attention turned to him. Thank you all for coming. My name is William Pettigrew. His voice was low and calm, and he didn't seem the least bit nervous when he spoke. Regis Hannigan was many things. Eccentric, curious, a lover of the mysterious, and my mentor. It is a great honor to be able to fulfill his greatest wish 22 years after his death. He cleared his throat. Which brings me to the main event for this evening. The unwrapping. He picked up the leather gloves and pulled them onto his hands. Then he placed them onto the edge of the sarcophagus and with a heavy swing, lifted the lid. The room was dim, but I could see what lay inside. Arms crossed, skin covered in gauze, still as death. It was a mummified corpse. William Pettigrew looked at it for a moment, and I could only imagine what that would have been like to see someone you were so close to in that state. Especially if you were the one who put him there. Then he picked up a tool from the table beside him and clamped it onto the edge of the gauze. He started to pull. The sound was unlike anything I had heard before, a ripping and tearing, the gauze shredded from decades of being pressed against a formaldehyde-soaked corpse. The smell wafted all the way to me, the strange mixed scent of heavy chemicals and fragrant herbs. Pettigrew kept pulling for a while, piling used yellow gauze on the table with his tools, occasionally having to pick up scissors and snip here and there, whether bits of fabric or stubborn skin, I didn't know. This is disgusting, Ander whispered beside me. How could it only take a few decades to turn into a full-blown mummy? I murmured back. Doesn't it usually take, thousands of years? Ander shrugged dismissively. Uncle Regis was an impatient man. Probably got Willie to give him the express embalming so we could all be here for this before we're dead too, he answered with a snicker. Eventually, legs began to appear, and the sight of them sent my heart straight into the deepest pit of my stomach. They were withered and dark and terrifying to see. Pettigrew kept unwrapping until he got to the torso. I could see that the chest was sunken, concave like the corpse was holding its breath, waiting to exhale. We're almost to the head now. William had stopped. He'd been going at a slow, steady pace, working his way up the body, but when he got past the chest and up to the neck, he came to a halt. Everyone in the room was silent, watching him. He leaned in closer, staring into the sarcophagus, his hands hovering over the body. This isn't, he murmured. Then he started to pull again, much faster than he had before, until the entire head was uncovered. I could catch glimpses of patches of dark hair and what was left of a nose, but that was about it. William, however, was staring at the body completely aghast, his jaw hanging open loosely. Is there a problem? The man with the pocket watch asked gruffly. William turned to face the gathering, his eyes wide, looking from each of us until they settled. Ander, he said quietly. The young man next to me gave an unconvincingly casual laugh. What's the matter, Willie? Mummy got your tongue? Took a few steps towards the body, and I could see his eyes drift into the sarcophagus. His smile dropped, and so did his crystal glass. It shattered on the floor, and I flinched. Ander walked slowly, his shoes crunching on the broken shards, until he was standing over the opening of the sarcophagus. He reached one trembling hand over the head of the mummy before it drifted down till it was over the chest. I stood on my toes to see what he was looking at. It looked to be a tattoo, warped by the embalming process and decay. It appeared to be the shape of some sort of bird, its wings spread. Anders' fingers traced it like recalling from a distant memory or dream. The man let out a small, choking sound before one word made its way out of his throat. Dad? The rules of the game are simple. We found them in the mouth of Anders' father's corpse. After the shock of the identity of the mummy had worn off, William Pettigrew anxiously pulled the small scroll out of the body's withered mouth and read it aloud. This letter is addressed to the following people. William Pettigrew, Regis's best friend. He said his own name with surprise. Ander Hannigan, Regis's grandnephew. Anders, still hovering above the corpse, looked up. Greta McIntyre, Regis's housekeeper. A stern woman's scowl deepened. Graham Wilberly, Regis's business partner. A man with a pocket watch gasped softly. The Jacoby twins, Forrest and Fawn, Regis's godchildren. The matching man and woman exchanged glances. And Wendy Lake, Regis's grandniece. The young woman's face remained blank, but her cheeks flushed. Lucas Hannigan, William's voice read shakily. He's dead, as you can all see. He has been dead for 10 years. Anders' hand clenched into a fist, and he brought it away from the body and back to his side. Although it was not Lucas's wish to be embalmed, nor was it his wish to die, it had to be so. William's hand shook as he grasped the paper from which he read. It has come to my attention that each of you possesses a level of corruption within yourselves that cannot be allowed to go unpunished. No one said anything to this, and William hesitated before he read what came next. Each of you is responsible for a number of atrocities that you, up until recently, have mistakenly believed to be unknown to those around you. I regret to inform you that this is not the case. It's time to atone for your sins that you've committed, as Lucas has made recompense for his. William glanced to the body lying still in the gold encasement, before he forced his eyes back onto the paper. His crime: theft of property belonging to the Hannigan estate. His sentence: death. William took a deep breath. I preserved him as a warning. Repent, confess, or face your sentence. Graham hesitated, one foot still turned towards the door. He looked from William to the body of Lucas Hannigan, and then finally, he looked at the ground. He muttered a few more words of frustration, but took a step back. The rules for your repentance are simple. The organs of Regis Hannigan and Lucas Hannigan were put into 7 canopic jars. 1 jar for each party member, each with instructions on how to atone for your sins. Find each jar and be permitted to leave. William took a shaky breath. Fail to do so by dawn tomorrow, and suffer the consequences. There was a long pause. Everyone looked at one another, each trying to stifle the panic that was plain on all of their faces. Then William spoke once more. His eyes ran across the very bottom of the page now, wide with alarm. One more thing, he read. Like you, I am not guiltless, nor am I so proud as to think myself undeserving of punishment. Therefore, I will play the game with you. A pause. In fact, I stand amongst you now, in this very room. This, everyone took an immediate step away from who they had been standing next to, save for the twins, who took one step in the same direction in unison. An unwavering and untrusting silence fell over the group, and then Ander tore his eyes away from his decaying father, his eyes shining in the candlelight with no yet fallen tears and anger. Who did this? He said coldly. No one spoke. Then suddenly, Andler's hand was tightened into a fist onto the collar of William's shirt. The paper fell from the old man's grasp as Anders' slim arm pulled him up to his eye level with surprising strength. This is your M.O., old man. Did you do this? Did you? Of course not, the man cried, his face turning red from the force of Anders' hand around his throat. "The whole time, I thought he abandoned me. But you knew! You knew where he was! You knew he was dead!" He said the last word with a particularly high dose of venom. "You killed him!" William tried to push Anders' hand away, and he flinched as the younger man yelled in his face. "No!" he sputtered. "Of course not. Your father had issues, but we were friends. You and Uncle Regis were friends too, and you yanked his organs out of his body too, didn't you?" Anders said, his head bending maniacally over the old man's. "Where is Uncle Regis's body?" William shook his head frantically. I don't know. It was supposed to be in there." He whimpered, waving one hand at the open sarcophagus. Anders looked back to the opening, back to his father's decaying body, and his face fell from anger to sadness. He loosened his grip on William's shirt and let him go. He slowly sank to the ground, leaning his head on the large, golden surface of the sarcophagus's side. "He was a terrible father," he said in a hollow voice. "But I never thought. I didn't want..." He trailed off, and his head fell heavily into his hands. "This is bullshit," he muttered bitterly. The twins, who were now looking incredibly afraid, had their hands clasped together. "Couldn't we just, Forrest stammered. "Try to leave?" Fawn finished. Greta, the stern woman, let out a snort. Go ahead. They'll probably be standing all around your bodies next. Do you want separate caskets, or would you prefer to be wrapped up together?" The twins shrank back at the woman's icy words, and their hands released from one another. "That's uncalled for," the young girl, Wendy, said coolly, and Greta rolled her eyes. "Don't scold me, little girl. You shouldn't even be here." "What atrocities could they even be talking about?" Fawn said nervously. "Forrest and I haven't done anything." "Me neither," Greta added quickly. Everyone began to make arguments of their innocence. No one listened to another's defense in favor of shouting their own. "Let's all just settle down now," William said loudly, though he looked anything but settled. Everyone fell into a pensive silence. I, meanwhile, was growing increasingly uncomfortable. My heart was beating fast and hard in the quiet, and my hands grew slick with sweat. I set my glass on the mantel of the fireplace behind me to keep it from slipping from my grip and joining the remains of Anders that still glimmered on the floor. Something about this was very wrong, and I knew it was only a matter of time before someone noticed. A matter of seconds, actually. "Sam?" I looked up. Anders was staring at me. Every ounce of the friendly air he had when we last spoke before the unveiling of his father's corpse was gone. Instead, his gaze was full of force, full of accusation, like a predator who suddenly spotted its prey. "You weren't on that list." He was right. William had read 7 names, which accounted for each person in the room and their relationship to Regis Hannigan. Except for mine. I had the overwhelming feeling that I was somewhere that I shouldn't be, seeing and hearing things I wasn't meant to, but I knew what this looked like to everyone else. I had just become their prime suspect. "I know," I said quickly, instinctively taking steps back. "This has to be some kind of mistake. I told you, I don't know why I'm here." "That's convenient," Greta said quietly, and this time no one corrected her. "It's true. The tape just showed up to my office. I don't know who sent it." I tried to battle back the panic riding in my voice. "I'm not part of this. I swear." Anders took a step towards me, his eyes redder than they had been before, his hands clenched tight into fists. "You are part of this. You have to be. You're the only stranger here." I shook my head and took a step back. "Anders, the letter said your dad died 10 years ago when I was a kid. That doesn't make any sense." Doesn't mean you couldn't be working with someone, he interrupted with barely contained rage. Tell us the truth! He let out an anguished shout of grief and fear, and I took one more step back, tripping over the fireplace poker in the stand and slamming my back hard against the brick of the fireplace. Clang! Anders' pursuit ceased, and I stood still, as we both looked at what had just fallen down from the chimney and into the fireplace. It was a shiny brass container, dusty with the ash of the hearth. It was about as large as a loaf of bread, and it had cracked as it landed, spilling its contents, which were now seeping out across the brick and down onto the carpet. It pooled at my feet, reddish-brown and murky, bits of something spongy and squelched over the edge and onto the floor. The smell that drifted from the slurry was acrid, bitter, and unfortunately, familiar. I picked up the two halves of the container, still dripping with stagnant blood, and pressed them together at the crack. Then I turned it around to show the others the two very distinct images that were on the front. One, the top, was a small sculpture of an animal, some sort of monkey. The other, taped securely to the front and stained red, was a photograph. It was a photograph of Graham Willoughby. And something else. It was lying on the bottom of the fireplace, submerged in ash and chunks of flesh. A plastic bag, most of it coated in blood. So it was impossible to see what was inside. However, I could read what was printed on the label. Jar number 1. The plastic bag we pulled from the viscous mixture of blood and ash had contained two things: a photograph and a folded piece of paper. We placed each on a side table in the parlor and gathered around to examine our findings. The photograph sent a cold shiver down my spine. Despite the fact that I couldn't tell exactly what the image was, it was some sort of entrance. At first I thought it was the stairs leading down into some crude basement. So dark was the center of the hallway. But once I spotted the dirt and the dust on the margins of the picture, I thought perhaps a mine shaft. I glanced as inconspicuously as I could at the faces peering over the photograph and was somewhat disappointed and simultaneously relieved. I didn't see anything resembling recognition or self-satisfaction, two things I might expect from the creator of the jar. Everyone's expression seemed pretty much matched up to the one that I imagined graced my face, a look of cluelessness and uneasiness. Except, of course, for Graham. Graham Willoughby's face had drained of all its color, and his lower lip trembled. Whatever this doorway was, he knew it well, and it frightened him to his very core. "What is this?" William Pettigrew finally asked. He gave a tentative side glance to the shaken man. "Graham?" "Read the paper," Graham replied, in a hoarse voice barely above a whisper. It was as if he couldn't tear his eyes from the photograph on the table, not even to read the words that came with it. As William unfolded the paper, something fell out and quickly fluttered to the ground. He picked it up and held it out for us to see. It was a small, red envelope about the size of a business card. He set it to the side and held the paper up to his face. He cleared his throat. "Graham Willoughby, confess your sins. After your confession, open the envelope, accept your punishment." We waited in anxious silence, watching the mustached man. Beads of sweat were rising like dew across his creased forehead. He said nothing, only stared deeper and deeper into the photograph. The emptiness of the entryway reflected back and hollow in his pupils. "I can't." Although I had only heard his voice full of nothing but confidence and assuredness, this phrase parted from his lips with a whimper. It was the sound of defeat. "You have to." Greta said this with as much less empathy than what the situation called for. "Or we're all going to end up like that," she added. pointing to the shriveled body of Lucas Hannigan, the one that still lay in the sarcophagus. Ander winced. Graham raised his eyes to the tomb, but quickly brought them back down to the photograph. He took a deep breath. As you know, I was Regis's business partner. He researched ancient cultures, civilizations. I'd help him organize archaeological digs at locations his data led us to. I looked to the photograph again, and I could see it now. Not a mine shaft, but the entrance to an underground dig site. It was somewhere close to Abydos, in Egypt, about 15 years ago. Regis had found evidence that suggested of another ancient city somewhere close by, so I secured him the logical things he would need to sponsor a dig. I got a group of archaeologists, kids from a university and their professors looking to get their hands dirty at a real site. I got other things ready too. He hesitated. Including equipment. He was obviously getting more agitated. He used one hand to wipe the excess sweat from his upper lip, and used his other to trace the outline of the dig entrance on the photo. I had gotten a tip on some less expensive bracers. The things they used to keep tunnels supported during underground digs. He clarified. I'd used the same supplier for years. I thought I could save some money and... He trailed off. Started shaking his head. They had some success at the site. And they wanted permission to dig deeper. The bracers were new. I only meant to try them out for an upper-level dig, but the more they find, the better for me, so... They were about 70 feet down when the tunnel collapsed. I could see his eyes glaze over as he stared transfixed at the photograph. Cheap bracers. The cheap bracers I bought, they failed. The whole thing came crumbling down, one fall triggering the next. It took a few weeks to dig back down to them, but by then... He closed his eyes. Everyone was already dead, crushed by the rocks. They died immediately. No one said anything. Not that I blame them. What could you say to something like that? Instead, William solemnly offered the small red envelope. Graham took it. We watched as he tore it open with shaky hands. His eyes moved right to left only once. There was a moment of confusion, as though he hadn't quite understood what he read, then comprehension dawned and the reaction was immediate. His skin turned even paler, and his breath stopped short in his throat. He very slowly placed the paper inside, on the table, next to the photo. It read, "When buried deep within the darkness, consume more air to stay alive." Again, I monitored the expressions of the people around me to see if this meant more to them than it did to me. This time, one other person besides Graham seemed different. William Pettigrew. His face was one of solemn pity mixed with disgust. He looked at Graham, who was still staring dumbstruck at the cryptic message he had just unveiled. "Graham, are you sure you've told us everything?" The other man shuddered and turned his face partially away from the group. He looked at the sarcophagus as though contemplating whether ending up like Adler's father was a better fate than whatever the envelope's message entailed for him. And then he spoke. "Like I said, it took about 3 weeks to get down there. The excavators were. I mean, most of them were crushed as soon as the tunnel collapsed. He hesitated. There was a small group that survived down there. A handful of the students survived around 2 weeks. The recovery team could see that much, but... He paused, and my pounding heartbeat filled his silence. They had eaten the dead. The reaction from the audience was noticeable. Fawn and Forrest both leaned slightly away from him in unison. Greta turned her head away, as though she had smelled something foul. Anders' hand framed his forehead as he began to nervously rock back and forth. Graham didn't meet anyone else's eyes as he continued. They had dug out the bodies from the soil in an attempt to survive, but they had no water, so none did. A wave of nausea swept over me, so powerful I feared I'd be sick. Anders swallowed hard before posing a valid question. So what does this mean? What's your punishment? He frowned at the small paper. Consume more air to stay alive? But the archaeologists didn't suffocate. They died from dehydration and being crushed. Graham opened his mouth to speak, but closed it, as though no words would come out. Instead, William spoke for him. The canopic jar, it's happy. The baboon-headed god. William stated this slowly, as though with each word our understanding was meant to grow. I, however, was still lost. He sighed heavily and gazed at Graham with something like sympathy in his eyes. It's the jar that holds the lungs. The dark sludge that seeped out of the jars divide. The spongy bits that fell into the carpet, pieces of human lungs, whether they were Regis, Hannigan's, or Lucas's, I had no idea. That's horrible, Fawn said, she and Forrest both looking reproachfully back at the fireplace. I still don't get it, Anders said, shaking his head. I do, Wendy said suddenly. She exchanged glances with William and looked at Graham, who was now holding his hands to either of his temples as though trying to manually keep his body from trembling with fear. Graham's greed turned those college kids into cannibals, she said matter-of-factly. I blinked in surprise at her brashness, as though she wasn't wrong. The punishment fits the crime. Oh, shit, Anders suddenly said, as though it had just hit him. And just like that, it came to me too. My head shot back towards the hearth, to the thick, dark paste that had coagulated on the brick. Consume more air to stay alive. Graham Willoughby would have to eat the lungs. It was Greta who scraped up the ash, blood, and lung paste out of the fireplace and onto a china plate. We set Graham up in the parlor at a small table and chair. William disappeared, then came back with a silver fork and a cloth napkin. We watched solemnly as Graham prepared for his grim feast. He looked down at the rancid mixture before him. Are we sure this is what the note meant? He asked shakily, his face tinged green. It seems extreme. This freak embalmed my father, Anders said with frustration. If anyone has an affinity for the extreme, it's them. Graham picked up his fork with a trembling hand. Very carefully, he stabbed the prongs into a spongy cube of lung, and stringy bits hung down as he lifted it towards his face. His eyes scanned around at the small crowd, witnessing his suffering. You're wasting your time, you know. We only have until dawn to find all these damn jars. He's right, William said, nodding gravely. We found one, which means there are 6 left. My best bet is to split up and search each room of the house. Immediately, pairs began to form. Of course, Fawn and Forrest stepped even closer to one another than they had already been previously. Wendy, oddly, immediately placed herself beside William. Ander, shooting me another suspicious glare, awkwardly stepped next to Greta, who looked less than pleased. I stood there, alone, feeling even more out of place than I already was. The others and I stared at one another for a moment until William took pity on me. Sam, he said, why don't you examine the master bedroom with Fawn and Forrest? The twins shot William identical, reproachful looks, and honestly, I wasn't much of a fan of this setup either. That's okay, I said. I can look on my own. William shook his head. I think it would be best if you didn't. There was something mildly threatening in his air. Like, even though Ander was the one who had put words to his suspicions of me, he hadn't been the only one thinking it. William Pettigrew turned back towards the man still seated and shaking at the table. Graham, he said quietly. Graham, hand still frozen around his fork, tore his eyes up from the monstrosity on his plate to look at William. You'll find me when you're done? Graham nodded. A haunted, hollow nod. And so, as the other groups drifted off to various corners of the large home, Fawn, Forrest, and I were upstairs, searching one of the fanciest bedrooms I'd ever seen. A dead man's bedroom. There was complete and utter silence until Fawn spoke. Forrest, I already checked there. The male twin closed the drawer of the tall mahogany dresser that he was peering into. He looked at his sister, who was standing on her toes, searching the top of the closet. Well, I already looked there, he said with exasperation. Fawn stepped out of the closet with a huff. Must be that psychological twin link people are always talking about, I said nervously, trying to lighten the tension. They didn't even glance in my direction. This is ridiculous, Fawn muttered, moving over to the wardrobe. This is why you have at least one kid. So that you don't need an elaborate will reading that gets hijacked by an insane person. Just one direct blood relative that you leave all of your stuff to. So the people who are here are the only family Regis had? I asked tentatively. Forrest gave a heavy sigh. He wasn't much of a people person. Our parents only made him our godfather because they wanted a bigger donation to their foundation, he said with a humorless laugh. Majority of his family's dead, so yes, his only family's here. Then his eyes narrowed into my direction. Plus a few extras, apparently. I gave him a weak smile. Graham, Greta, and William aren't really family either. Yes, but they at least knew the man. The hostility in the room was rising, and I didn't like it. Not because I don't enjoy conflict, although I don't, but for one specific fact. Either one of these people could be a deranged murderer. It might be a stretch, given their young age, but teenagers can be killers too, and something told me that if one twin was behind it, the other wasn't going to be innocent. Well, Wendy didn't know him. She was born after he died, I wagered. Blood is blood, Fawn said forcefully. It's the most important bond there is. She and Forrest exchanged a brief look. At this point, I was getting annoyed. My irritation fueled by the fact that time was ticking away faster than I would have liked, and the distrust and suspicion that was being thrust upon me. You know, we're all in the same boat here, I said. I didn't want to get that creepy video, and I definitely didn't want to be a part of this bizarre murder mystery party. I bent down to the floor to search under the bed, but there was nothing there. When I brought my head back up, the twins had both stopped rifling the room. Instead, they were staring at me, confusion on their face. What? I asked, my face flushed. We didn't get any video. My heart started beating faster, and I got up from the floor. The video. The one where Regis kind of rambles on about Egyptomania and how he's going to be embalmed? I looked anxiously into each of their faces, but there was no hint of recognition. It was basically the invitation to this party. 25 years after his death, he wanted to have us all watch his unwrapping. Still nothing? You didn't get a copy? The twins both shook their heads. They seemed less frustrated than they had been before. Now they just looked scared. We got paper invitations through the mail. It was totally normal. Calligraphy and stationery, Fawn said. And when was this video from? Forrest asked with hesitation. The footage was grainy and the tape skipped about every 7 seconds, but I could still see the old man on the screen, the timestamp that read August 5th, 1998, and I could hear it very clearly when he spoke. Congratulations, you've been cordially invited to the last unwrapping party on Earth. Something didn't make sense. The video was from 1998. William Pettigrew, when he first addressed the crowd before we found out how big of a mess that we were in, he said, "It's a great honor to be able to fulfill his greatest wish, 22 years after his death." It was from 1998, I said quietly. 22 years ago. How had I not noticed? It was impossible for the party to be taking place 25 years after he just died, since I had seen him in a 22-year-old video. Something else. Regis Hannigan had to have died soon after making that tape. The twins and I stood shocked, pensive silence. I stared at the floor beneath my feet, trying to make sense of what I'd learned. The air hung around us, quiet and empty, and then I lifted my head, expecting their gazes of accusation to be even more potent than they had been before this new discovery. But they weren't looking at me. Instead, their eyes were aimed at something behind me. I followed their stares and turned to see the object of their attention. At first I didn't see anything. Then, there it suddenly was. The lamp on the bedside table, which was off, glinted a familiar gold in the overhead light. I soon realized it wasn't a lamp at all. Quickly, I lifted off the shade, which had merely been propped on the jar's lid. Though the smooth side had been facing out, I turned it over quickly to reveal what lay on the other side. As soon as we saw who was in the photograph, the jar was snatched from my hands. Fawn grabbed it quickly, and she and Forrest were now staring at it in despair. And I understood why. Again, there were two images on the second canopic jar. One, the engraving of a human head in Egyptian style. Another, a photograph of Fawn, smiling brightly with her arm wrapped around Forrest's shoulders. Fawn had the lid off the jar in record time. The unfortunately familiar smell drifted immediately up and out of the jar, and I thought of poor Graham downstairs. I wondered if he managed to take that first bite yet. Before anyone could speak, Fawn's arm was elbow deep in a scarlet mixture of blood and organ. She felt around for a moment, then pulled it back out. The jar fell easily from her grasp and onto the floor. The sludge stood out stark against her skin, like one long velvet glove. Held in her grip was another blood-smeared plastic bag, labeled Jar Number 4. She opened it, and with her clean hand pulled out the contents. First, the photograph. When Fawn and Forrest saw it, there was a change in their expressions from apprehension to horror. Slowly, I crept up behind the two in order to see what they had uncovered. It wasn't what I thought it was going to be, though I'm not sure what I had expected. It was a car. A bright, shiny classic one, with the rounded hubcaps and light blue paint. It was parked in a driveway on a sunny day. I didn't see anything nefarious about it, but if Graham's jar had been any indication, the story behind it was going to be a grim one. Fawn reached out a blood-stained finger, gently stroked the edge of the photograph, dyeing it red. "Ferris," she murmured softly. "Who's Ferris?" I asked carefully. Forrest's mouth hardened into a set jaw straight line. "We're triplets," he said tersely. "Ferris was our brother." I tried to hide my surprise and spoke slowly. "Was?" Neither of the siblings said anything. Forrest wordlessly took the folded paper from Fawn and unfurled it. Inside, just like before, was a scarlet envelope. He removed it and read from the paper first. "Fawn and Forrest Jacoby, confess your sins. After your confession, open the envelope. Accept your punishment." "It's for both of you?" I asked quickly, a bleak realization gradually dawning on me. "Both our pictures are on the front," Fawn answered, still gazing deeply into the photograph of the car. She didn't even glance up as Forrest opened the red envelope. "When difficult to choose a direction, choose a space within the center of yourself." A remarkably similar expression suddenly crossed the faces of each of the strangers before me. A look of anxiety, of worry, of sadness, and of fear. If I had to give it a name, it would be guilt. Then they snapped their heads to the side, one to the right, one to the left, as they both looked at one another in absolute fury. In perfect unison, they growled, "What did you do?" Neither had the opportunity to answer, because suddenly there came a great crash from downstairs. We ran down the steps, Forrest with the notes from the jar, Fawn with the photograph of the strange car still clutched in her bloodied fist. Back in the parlor, much was the same as when we had left it. There, the sarcophagus lay open, and Adler's father still remained shriveled and musty within it. The plate, the one with the mixture of ash and lung that had been set before Graham Willoughby, still sat on a small table, apparently mostly untouched. But the man himself, Graham, was gone. "Graham?" Forrest called out. "In here," a voice responded, and we ran to it. In the foyer, beside the great wooden door I had walked through when I had arrived at the Harrington house, was a lifeless body laying still on a rug. Standing over it were two people, William Pettigrew and Greta McIntyre, looking shocked and appalled. "What happened?" I asked with panic. William answered, his voice low and grave. "He must have tried to leave." I walked slowly, feet squeaking against the floorboards, over to the spot on the floor where the body lay. Immediately, I felt the burning sensation of bile rising up in my throat. The body had no head. It wasn't a clean cut either. The edges of the neck were ragged like fabric frayed at a ripped seam. From up close, I could see that the body wasn't on a rug at all. The blood seeped from its newly formed stump of a neck had merely formed a circle around him. I wanted so badly to avert my eyes, but something had caught my attention, something glimmering brass on the body's torso. The silence was so hushed in the foyer, interrupted by one less heartbeat, that I could hear something else instead. The ticking of a pocket watch, sitting cold on Graham Willoughby's still chest. The message was clear, but someone had gone to the trouble of leaving a note anyway. It was written not on paper, like those in the jars, but instead was scrawled on a piece of embroidered fabric, a handkerchief with 3 initials stitched in it. R.W.H. And a brief message written in something red and flecked with ash. "You're running out of time." It was a little past midnight and Graham Willoughby was dead. William placed a white tablecloth over his body, but we left him in the foyer. We decided it was best not to disturb the crime scene when we made it out of this, if we made it out of this, and are able to call the police, since we definitely didn't dare to now. Eventually, Andrew and Wendy joined us, and we gathered once again in the parlor, where Graham's untouched last meal of lung sat on the small table. We were silent for a moment, but not out of respect for the dead, It was the reverberating quiet of 6 people, rendered speechless in the face of palpable fear. We had put the pocket watch and the handkerchief on the now closed lid of the sarcophagus, the cloth stained with a note that told us what we already knew. We were running out of time. "Are we going to talk about it?" Ander said bitterly. "Talk about what?" William asked. "The initials," Ander answered impatiently. "RWH. We all know what that means." Regis Warren Hannigan. I hadn't even thought about that, but it wasn't enough evidence to convince me of any one thing. "Maybe it's just something they grabbed from inside the house. It might not mean anything," I said tentatively. "You sound like you're speaking from experience," Greta said with a leer. "It's a valid point," Wendy combated. "This house is full of the old man's stuff." "Leave the detective work to the adults," Greta shot back. "I'm older than I look," Wendy said with a huff. All right, William said hurriedly. "Let's settle down." He swallowed nervously. "Our man is dead. I would guess by his position in the foyer that his gruesome death was a result of his attempt to escape the house. From now on, we need to be smart. Leave this impulsiveness and this anger," he said, looking at Greta and Wendy, "behind us." The room fell into silence, tinged with shame. It oddly felt like we had just been scolded by a parent. Finally, William spoke again. "Did anyone find anything?" "No," the twins quickly answered in unison, as Fawn tried ineffectively to tuck the blood-coated arm behind her. "Yes," I said at the exact same time. This earned me 2 angry glances, the 2 heavy sighs. "We found our jar," Forrest said in defeat. "He was upstairs in the bedroom." He revealed the papers that he had in his hand, and Fawn brought out the photograph. "An old car?" Wendy said. "What's your big secret?" The siblings exchanged glances with one another, but this time they weren't looking for silent understanding. Instead, they were glances of distrust. "It seems," Fawn said, "that both of our wrongdoings have to do with our brother." "Great, there's more of you," Greta muttered. "Not anymore," Forrest answered darkly. Neither of the siblings offered any more information. Then, to my surprise, William addressed me. "Sam, could you go fetch us the jar?" "Me?" William nodded, and no one protested. It seemed that the suspicion that had been cast upon me had been momentarily shifted to Forrest and Fawn. I traveled back up the stairs to the same bedroom. My stomach turned as I saw what lay on the ground. The jar, open when it had been dropped from Fawn's hands, had now spilled out onto the ground. It formed a dark circle, the same that had seeped out of the first jar and out of the fireplace, and the same as the one that had surrounded Graham's headless body. It was becoming all too familiar a sight. I picked up the jar, which was mostly empty, I hoped, for a multitude of reasons, that Forrest and Fawn's punishment would have nothing to do with the jar's contents. I took a step forward towards the door, then stopped. There was an added weight to the jar. It was made out of brass, which was heavy enough on its own, but as I walked, there was a movement inside, a dull thud of something rocking against the sides of the container. I took a deep breath, then I thrust my arm inside. Inside of the jar was cold, which immediately struck me as strange, although it made sense. It had been stored in a metal jar for quite some time, yet when I think of the feeling of blood on my skin, I expect warmth. There it was. Something even colder still, wrapped in plastic, lying at the bottom of the jar. I pulled it out, and upon seeing what it was, immediately brought it downstairs. I started awkwardly. This was at the bottom. The reaction of the gathering was immediate and understandable. Most people would recoil at the sight of a stranger holding a revolver, even one wrapped firmly in blood-soaked plastic. We took Graham's plate of viscera and put it by the fireplace, replacing it on the small table with this newfound bundle. William began to unwrap it, although there was no one here that I trusted. He seemed to be the only one who had even a hint of confidence, and maybe that was something I should have been worried about. It was a black revolver. That's about the best way I could describe it. I'm not much of a gun fanatic, but there was something I had missed the first time around. Small slip of paper, rolled up and tucked right in the gap of the trigger. William read it aloud. "It's time for a game. The rules are simple. Old-fashioned roulette. First, make your confessions, then spin the chamber once. Take turns pointing the pistol to your chest. You know the place, and pull the trigger." What little color was left in William's face drained from it. "First one to die loses." We moved to the dining room. The four of us not involved in the game stood against the wall on either side of the long table that stretched the length of the space. At one end sat Forrest. At the other, Fawn. In the center was the photograph, the one of the old car. William held the pistol in his hands that trembled. "I think," he said heavily, "you have to tell us the story first. Whatever it is you two have done." "That's the thing," Fawn said. "I know what I've done. What I don't understand is why Forrest would be involved in this too." She looked down to her hands, fidgeting in her lap. "This was between me and Ferris." Forrest's face was the picture of confusion. "This is between me and Ferris," he said. "I'm the reason he's dead." Fawn's eyes grew wide and her mouth fell silently ajar. "I'm the reason he's dead." Her gaze drifted to the image of the car in the center of the table. "I cut his brakes." Forrest actually sat back in the chair with the force of the words that his sister had just uttered. "You what?" he said incredulously. I could see the light of the chandelier overhead shine in the tears that were building in Fawn's eyes. "That day, the day of the accident, I was angry. I went into his car and... Her voice faltered, but we all knew how that sentence ended. I didn't mean it, Forrest. I was upset. I knew you two were planning to run away, to leave me behind." "You didn't mean it," Forrest repeated with malice. "You were upset." His face burned red with rage. "This whole time I thought..." His anger faded only slightly, replaced with a tinge of sadness. "He was coming to me. We were leaving that night, and he was supposed to pick me up." He looked back to Fawn coldly. "I didn't know you even knew what we were planning." Fawn blinked, and a tear rolled over her waterline and down her cheek. "Why were you going to leave without me? You don't deserve an explanation, you murderer," he hissed back at her. And then he turned to William. "We're ready to start. Let's get this over with." The old man hesitated. "That's it? Are you sure that's all you're meant to say?" He questioned tentatively. I understood his suspicion. Fawn cut her brother's brakes and killed him, sure, but Forrest's entire crime had been attempting to run away with his brother when they were teenagers. Something seemed off. "That's it," Forrest said, his mouth thin and grim. He glared at Fawn from across the table. "Give me the gun." William waited a moment before then. He gave the cylinder one hard spin. We all listened in hushed silence, and the metal clicked into place. 7 bullets in a round, William said nervously. Then he handed the gun to Forrest, who took it. Forrest turned the barrel of the gun at his chest. He moved it around slightly until it was in a spot in his right side, directly across from his heart on the left. "This is the spot, isn't it, Fawn?" he said bitterly. "This is where that fence post went straight through our brother after you cut his brakes, right?" Fawn didn't answer. She only watched as Forrest, staring hatefully back at her, pulled the trigger. Nothing. First bullet was cleared. Forrest put the gun back on the table, his body shaking with adrenaline. He let out a gust of air, then he slid the revolver across the length of the table. Fawn caught it at her end. She picked it up, but didn't aim it. "Why were you two going to run away?" she asked quietly. "Our parents were rich, emotionally unavailable sociopaths, Fawn. How could we not want to leave that behind?" "But," she said even softer, "without me." It was complicated," Forrest said vaguely. I thought I saw a hint of guilt break through the anger in his expression, but he didn't add anything more. Fawn waited a moment before turning the gun towards herself. She too adjusted it to the exact same spot in the right of her chest. She looked at her brother, a long, sad look, and then she pulled the trigger. The second shot was empty. She slid the gun back to Forrest. The next 3 shots continued in silence. Slide. Slide. With every click, the room's level of apprehension rose. Beads of sweat collected on each side of the siblings' brows. Forrest finished his 3rd shot, then slid it back to Fawn. Only 2 shots left. If Fawn didn't die in this round, that meant it would be Forrest. Fawn picked up the gun, but just held it in her hands, not taking aim. She looked at her brother. "Forrest, you're not telling us everything." The man avoided her eyes as his gaze skirted across the room at the audience that was witnessing his fate unfold. Fawn motioned to the revolver in her hands. "Please, only 2 shots left. Don't let me die with unanswered questions." Silence hung heavy in the air. We were going to kill Mom and Dad." Everyone's attention turned to Forrest. He stared at his hands clasped on the table in front of him. "We had everything ready. A special kind of poison. Expensive, undetectable. It was supposed to go into their drinks that night. I made a test batch to make sure that it would fully dissolve in the liquid. Some water in the old kettle. Nobody ever used it. Sometimes the housekeep used it to water the plants." He paused. "I was already out, gathering supplies, when I realized I hadn't emptied the kettle." He twisted his hands together with discomfort as he continued. "Like I said, no one used it. But I had a bad feeling. I found a payphone. I called the house. I asked Ferris what he was doing. He said He choked slightly. His little words were difficult to get out. "He said he just had a cup of tea. Our housekeeper had given that day off, and he couldn't find out how to use the electric one, so he used the old kettle." He took a shaky breath. "I panicked. I told him to come meet me. I didn't want to tell him about the mistake I'd made. He agreed. We hung up the phone, and that was the last time we spoke." He looked at his sister. "I always thought I had killed him. At least that would have been an accident. You took him away on purpose." Fawn still held the gun in her hand. She was staring at her brother with a hollow, blank expression that was difficult to place. "You were going to kill our parents and run away with our brother, leaving me completely alone, an orphan." Forrest didn't say anything. "I loved you," Fawn said in a low voice. "I thought you loved me too." "I always loved him more, Fawn. And I thought you knew that. That's why he had to go, right?" Forrest met his sister's eyes, each lit with an identical fire of rage and hurt. Forrest leaned forward, slightly closing the gap between his sister and himself at either end of the lengthy table. Then he said something he wouldn't be able to take back. "It should have been you." The words hovered in the air around the two for a brief moment. Then Fawn raised the revolver. She aimed it directly at the spot on the chest, the one on the right side across from the heart. Only she didn't turn it towards herself. Instead, she had her arm outstretched, aiming at the spot on her only remaining brother, the same spot that had ended the life of the first. "Wait," William said quietly, taking a half step forward. "This isn't right. This wasn't what the rules said." Fawn didn't listen. Instead, she met eyes with her brother, and again, they seemed to share the same silent understanding, the kind that only two people have been together since the beginning can. She pulled the trigger once. She pulled it again. I've heard gunshots before. There's nothing quite like a single shot ringing out in a silent dining room. No one moved in the second after Fawn pulled the trigger, save for our eyes, which moved in unison to Forrest's chest, looking for any sign of blood blossoming from that spot across from his heart. But none came. Fawn unclenched her tight, shut eyelids and examined the revolver, a curious expression on her face. Her skin paled as she saw what we all soon did. Instead of a bullet protruding from the barrel of the gun, it was a tiny flag. It was red, the same scarlet as the letters in the jars. It read in stark white lettering, "Bang." It was like something out of an old cartoon, which can be disturbing on its own, even amidst the relief of discovering that the final shot had been a blank. Fawn stared vacantly as William gingerly removed the cold metal from her trembling hands. As he turned it over, I could see that there was a small writing on the back of the flag. "Let grief convert to anger," William read. "Blunt, not the heart. Enrage it." "Macbeth," Wendy said slowly, and William nodded. We let the quote reverberate throughout the room, the full sentiment of it sinking deep into each of us. "How do you even know that?" Ander asked incredulously, but Wendy didn't answer. Perhaps she was busy considering the same unfortunate truth that had only then come to me. Whoever was orchestrating this knew how the game of roulette would end. That one of the twins, in the wake of learning the full truth, wouldn't be able to resist spending the last bullet on the other. It was reassuring, at least, to know that Fawn hadn't broken the rules after all. But still, knowing secret information about each of the party's attendants was one thing. But being able to correctly guess how their minds would react in a tense situation is something else entirely. Unless, of course, the twins were behind all of this. Forrest, clearly shaken, raised a hand and pressed it against the spot on his chest where we had all expected a wound to be. He looked at his sister. His voice was quiet and empty. "You would have done it." Fawn slowly started to shake her head. No, I wasn't," she started, but realized there was no real defense she could make for herself. Instead, fell silent. William, however, wasn't listening to the words being exchanged. Instead, he absent-mindedly took a seat on the side of the table, his attention focused on the revolver and flag in his hands. "It's interesting," he said, "that the perpetrator would choose to quote Macbeth." "I thought so too," Greta said, taking a seat next to him. "Why is that?" Wendy asked. William smiled softly. "Regis loved Shakespeare. He has a complete anthology of his work in his study." I felt a pang of sadness at William's sudden tenderness. It was easy to forget, amongst all of this, that he was closer to Regis than anyone. Even after all this time, Can't be easy to be here, with a group of mostly strangers rooting through his things. And a bust, Greta said suddenly. A bust of Shakespeare. He was always such a pain to dust. The rare few times I've been allowed to clean Mr. Hannigan's study. Somehow I had completely forgotten that Greta had been Regis's housekeeper. It could be a coincidence, William said, but I have the overwhelming feeling that nothing this person does is unintentional. I suggest we search the study. Wendy nodded, as did I. The twins remained at each other's end of the table, both still shocked at what had transpired between them. Fawn, Forrest, William said quietly. Neither twin turned their attention towards the man, their gazes locked on each other. I suggest you stick with the group. Though they seemed mentally detached, they got up from the table with the rest of us and followed as we made our way to the study. They seemed to be in shock, and to be honest, I was sort of glad. I knew I was distrusted in this group, and I frankly didn't trust any of them either. It felt best to keep my knowledge of the tape I had received as close to the chest as possible, and if Fawn and Forrest were too distracted with their own drama to speak out about it, then that may buy me some more time to figure things out. Although the rest of the house was clean and precise, like a movie set from a Victorian period piece, the study was a bit different. It looked as though it had been used by a madman. Papers covered every surface, open books with extinguished candlesticks balanced on their pages. Even though Regis had been dead for decades, it looked as though he could still be working at his desk this very evening. William let out a heavy sigh when he entered the room. I've kept this room closed off since Regis's death, as long as I could. I knew whoever inherited this place would open this door eventually. He trailed off. There's the bust, Greta said, pointing to the half-hidden marble profile that was only slightly visible through an open newspaper that covered its face. She dug it out and held it. What now? Check around where it was, Wendy said, moving towards the desk and rummaging through the papers, causing William to wince. The twins stood in the doorway, neither offering to help nor speaking to one another. Wait, Greta said suddenly. She shook the bust in her hands. I think it might be in here. We gave her a wide berth. Then, she smacked the edge of the bust against the ground. The bottom of the marble crumbled away with a sharp crack. Then a gleaming brass canopic jar slid out of the bust and onto the floor. We all stared at it for a moment, the question hanging heavy in the air. Whose jar would this be? Greta used her hand to wipe away some of the rocky dust that had obscured the photograph on the jar's surface. Then, when the face came into view, she quickly jerked her hand back, as though something had bitten her. And it was clear to see why. Greta's picture was on the jar. She let out a small sound like a whimper of fear, or else disappointment. The rest of us looked at her with pity, and from Wendy, Ander, and William, a bit of relief. It's a shame about the bust, she said shakily, nudging the broken pieces with her foot. It seemed as though she was stalling, no doubt dreading whatever the thing contained within the jar would reveal. One less part of the inheritance. To my surprise, Ander gave out a short, involuntary laugh. That's so weird. I had actually forgotten why we'd come here in the first place. Then he looked to William. You never told us who inherited Uncle Reggie's property. It won't matter if we're all dead by the end of the night, Wendy said bitterly. William shook his head. I'm afraid I don't know myself. That information is in a sealed envelope in the parlor. I was instructed by Regis to open it at this very party, after the unwrapping, and no sooner. Then his eyes widened a bit. Actually, someone better go fetch that. It's the only copy I have. Someone could tear it up, and then Regis's final will would be lost. He turned to me, and the two figures beside me. Sam, why don't you, Forrest and Fawn, go look? Maybe give them a chance to cool off. Safety in numbers, I said back, though I had an uneasy feeling in the pit of my stomach. I walked in silence back to the parlor, the twins trailing behind me. My eyes kept flitting to check on each corner. to ensure they hadn't reconciled just in time to plan my murder. Back in the parlor, I started looking around, searching for the envelope that William had described. Fawn began to search too, but Forrest didn't move. "I don't see anything," I said, after checking the surface of the table. "Me neither," Fawn answered. She glared at Forrest, who appeared to be staring into the fireplace, at the last bit of a goo that hadn't been scraped up and served to Graham. "You're not helping," she said to her brother, in a low, malice-filled voice. Still, the other twin said nothing. I moved over to the sarcophagus and knelt down. William had been standing right beside it. It wasn't too far of a stretch for it to have fallen from his person, and under the podium that had the golden casket. As I peered into the small crack of darkness between the piece of furniture and the carpet, I did something I'd been trying to avoid, I thought. I thought about what was going to happen if we didn't find the jars in time. What sort of terrible punishment this lunatic would have waiting for us at dawn. We'd found jar number 1, which had been Graham's, and jar number 4, which had been Forrest and Fawn's. They just found Greta's, so we'd see what number hers is when she got done opening it in the other room. Uh-oh. Just then, it hit me. The note that William had read said that there would be 7 jars we would need to find over the course of that night. 7 jars, which each jar being attributed to one of the 7 guests that were also included on the list: William, Graham, Greta, Fawn, Forrest, Ander, and Wendy. Except Fawn and Forrest shared a jar that was assigned to a single number. Jar number 4. Meaning that there was going to be one for a guest that wasn't on the original invite list. In other words, I realized that I might very well have some atonement in store. I stayed on the ground, staring deep into the empty chasm. There was no envelope there, but I wasn't ready to come up yet. I certainly wasn't sure if I should tell anyone, but the total number of secrets I was keeping from the rest of this group was piling higher and higher. "There's nothing under here," I started to say, but I was interrupted by a strange series of noises. Schlack! There was a soft, wet sound, followed by the gust of air being sharply exhaled. I brought my head up. Forrest was still standing by the fireplace, but I could see now that he hadn't been staring at the residue of Graham's last meal coagulated in the ash. No, he had his gaze fixed on the fire pokers that stood in the stand next to it. The same stand that I had tripped over at the beginning of all this, that led me to finding the first jar. Not all of them were in the stand. Instead, one was in Forrest's grasp. His arm pointed straight out, and the tip emerging scarlet from the right side of Fawn's back. "Hey there." Fawn's body fell to the ground, still impaled on the poker, a ribbon of blood snaking out of her parted lips and dripping soft onto the floor. I stood up from where I'd been kneeling by the sarcophagus and rushed to where she lay. "Fawn," I said, panicked, my own heart pounding as I frantically felt her wrist for a pulse. Her eyes had rolled back to the whites. They fluttered once, twice, 3 times before a gurgle popped the bubble of blood in her mouth. And everything went still. I took my violently shaking hands off her skin. They had already turned sticky with the drying fluid that covered them. Slowly, I brought my head up. Forrest was standing above us both. His face held the same expression of hollow shock that his sister had when she realized that she had fired that final bullet at her brother's chest. Then Forrest opened his mouth, and out came the loudest, most mournful wail I had ever heard. He lunged at me. It seemed instinctual. I think the image of me, a stranger, kneeling next to his sister's dead body made more sense to his mind in that moment than what he had actually done. He quickly was on top of me, hands pounded my chest with fists of rage and grief. I tried to fight him off, but he had the advantage as soon as he decided to attack. I looked to my right where Fawn's white eyes stared back at me. I had little doubt that if I didn't find a way to stop Forrest soon, That would be me in a few short minutes. Then I turned to my left. I brought my hand up quickly, striking Forrest across the face with the object that I held. He immediately fell backwards, clasping his hands over his right eye as red seeped down his fingers. Glancing down at my own palm, my blood intermingling with the stain of Fawn's, I could see what I had found. A particularly large shard of crystal from Anders' dropped brandy glass, when he had first discovered his father's death. That seems so long ago. Before Forrest recovered, I took off. By some miracle, I remembered the path back to the study. I burst into the room, but everyone was already staring at the doorway, no doubt because they had heard Forrest's outburst. I stood there for a moment out of breath, the soreness in my chest making it hard to fill my lungs. William, Wendy, and Ander still stood around the room, forming a half-circle around Greta, who was on the floor. Her jar was still closed. She cradled it in her arms like a child. "Sam?" William said cautiously. "What happened?" I realized how it must have looked. Me, the unknown guest, barging into the room, my hands covered in blood. Forrest, I was surprised at how hard it was to actually say. "He killed Fawn." Greta got up off the floor. Then the room quickly separated. Me standing by the door, and the other four gazing at me with mistrust. Ander looked as though he might pass out. "He did?" he croaked. And I nodded. If I'd gotten the correct impression that he had been under the influence of something at the start of this. 4 sets of eyes collectively scanned my hands for blood, and my eyes for truth. Then, without a sound, Forrest walked in. He wasn't covering his head anymore, and I could see the full extent of the damage I'd done. The shard of glass I had raked across his face had made a deep gash from his right temple all the way to the left side of his jaw. His one eye was staring at me, bloodshot and angry, while the other was just gone. I couldn't tell if it was somewhere destroyed within the mottled flesh that hung from his face, or if we would find it later, rolled under some chair in the parlor. Slowly, he raised his hand and pointed directly at me. The two of us, so close his finger brushed the end of my nose, causing me to flinch. I was too frightened to move, my legs suddenly heavy and useless. Bits of spittle flecked red from his mouth as he spoke 3 remarkable words. "He killed Fawn." I swallowed hard, my stomach turning. "Forrest, you killed Fawn." I stole a glance at the rest of the group. This couldn't look good. I was literally red-handed. While my gaze was turned, Forrest stepped forward, and before I knew it, his hands were around my throat. He began to squeeze. There immediately was yelling. I tore at his grip, but it was too powerful, and the lack of oxygen was making me weak. Ander and William pulled at Forrest, yanking him by the waist backward, but he wasn't working. Forrest was looking into my eyes as I lost feeling in my face, the one remaining eye so much like Fawn's, who still lay dead on the floor in the parlor. Then, just as I was starting to see spots, the grip loosened. There was a great thump, but I was too busy sputtering and coughing to look. I gingerly rubbed my neck as my vision sharpened, and I was able to make out the sight in front of me. Forrest on the floor, the one intact eye closed. There was so much blood and viscera in a pile on his head and the carpet that I thought for a moment that his head had actually exploded. Then I looked up. Greta stood, one jagged half of her canopic jar raised above her head, ready to let it swing at Forrest's head again. We decided to tie Forrest up in the dining room. It seemed like the best course of action. The parlor had the sarcophagus, the broken glass, all sorts of things in that he could potentially get into trouble with, plus his sister's dead body. The contents of Greta's jar had been much the same as everyone else's. A photograph that seemed to cause her deep emotional pain, a piece of folded paper, and an envelope. She hadn't opened the paper yet, nor the envelope, but the photograph. Photograph she stared at for quite some time. It was a little creepy to me. It was a picture of one of those corn husk dolls, kind you see in books about colonial times. looked old, smudged with dirt. The worst thing about it, a crude red smile drawn onto the face with a shaky hand. After Greta had been able to set down her jar's contents, she had expertly wrapped a bandage across Forrest's eye, a long piece of gauze that wrapped around his head. William went back to the master bedroom and used some of Regis's old neckties to tie Forrest's wrists and ankles to the chair that he sat in, the one at the end of the table, where he had last spoken with his sister. He had stayed unconscious from Greta's blow until after William was done tying him up. Then his head began to roll and his eye fluttered open. It darted from person to person as he saw everyone watching him. It settled on me, and his hands and feet jerked like he was trying to move towards me. I immediately took a sharp step back, even though I knew that he couldn't get up. "What is this?" he spat angrily, looking at his bonds. "What's happening?" William spoke softly and slowly. "There was an accident, Forrest." He paused, his hands nervously intertwining in front of him. "Fawn has died." His gaze turned back to me. "That was no accident. He killed her." "No, I didn't," I said. My voice, weak and raspy from Forrest's throttling. I couldn't tell if Forrest was just trying to pin his own murder on me, or if he genuinely experienced a mental break. "It was him! He's a liar!" Forrest said, and it was clear that he was getting more and more worked up. He began writing in his chair, the legs scraping slightly against the floorboards. Red was bleeding through the gauze now, and the sight was nightmarish. Ander looked at me skeptically. "What's he talking about?" "I don't know," I croaked back. That wasn't necessarily true. There was a number of things I had kept quiet about. At this point, it was only a matter of time before they came out. "Perhaps we should go to the parlor to talk," William said. "And, of course, to attend to Fawn's body." The rest of the group nodded. Wendy looked grim, and Greta still cradled the one unshattered half of her jar. At the mention of his sister's corpse, or perhaps at the sight of the rest of us exiting, Forrest began to writhe even more. Foaming spit began to seep from his mouth, tinged pink from the blood of the wound on his face. "Wait! Wait! Wait!" He let out an animalistic scream. But we didn't stop. "Ask him about the tape!" That was the last thing we heard before we left the room. We stopped, and everyone's attention turned to me. And an even more powerful sense of dread spread throughout my body. Each person looked at me in a mix of confusion and apprehension. William, however, appeared more curious than anything else. "Yeah, we definitely need to talk." Speaking over the frenzied screams and sobs from Forrest in the dining room, I finally told the others about the tape. There had been stunned silence as we stood around the parlor. Fawn's body had been moved, unceremoniously dragged from the fireplace to the foyer. You could follow the long streak of blood like breadcrumbs to where Graham and Fawn's corpse lay under the cloth. Wendy had been the first to speak. "Why didn't you say anything sooner?" This was a valid question. I only just realized that my invitation had been different when Fawn and Forrest and I were in the bedroom. I was sweating now, my hands nervously intertwining as I spoke. There didn't seem to be any time to mention it. Things were moving so quickly, and I knew that it would make me stand out more than I already do. Like I don't belong here. "You don't belong here," Greta retorted, her photograph paper and unopened envelope still clenching tightly in her grasp. "You weren't even mentioned in the letter at the start of all this." "I know," I said quickly. "I don't understand it either, but I think I'm supposed to be here." I didn't mention the math I had done earlier, that since Fawn and Forrest had shared one jar, there were 6 left, one undoubtedly with my picture in it. Wendy shook her head tiredly. "Even if we want to believe you, Sam, it's still undeniable that you're an outlier in all this. You aren't like the rest of us." Yeah, like maybe he's a murderer, Greta said bitterly. That's enough. Williams spoke calmly but with authority. It's time we take a moment to try to sort out some of the specifics of our situation. He took out of his pocket a small pad of paper and a pen and flipped through to a blank page. We know that there are 5 jars left. Only a few hours left to find them. We aren't even halfway done, he said grimly. As he wrote out 5 jars on the paper, out of the corner of my eye I thought that I saw Ander shifting uncomfortably, but decided I imagined it. We know Graham is dead because he tried to leave, William continued. We know Fawn is dead because Forrest killed her. His eyes flitted to me for just a moment, and I wondered how firmly he believed what he was saying. Here's what we should be wondering, William said. He wrote the following list on the sheet. Rules. Head. Regis. 22. 7. He held up the pad of paper and pointed to his first word. First off, rules. I'm a bit concerned over the nature of Fawn's death. He swallowed nervously. Graham died as part of the system. He tried to leave, and he paid the price. Fawn, however, another suspicious glance towards me, died under circumstances outside of the game. I'm concerned, as we all should be, that this may bring unwanted consequences upon the group, or upon the offending parties. It was my turn to feel uncomfortable, as I sensed everyone's attention turn to me for a moment. Next, head, William continued. Graham Willoughby's body was found by the door. But where is his head? I blinked in surprise. It seemed so obvious, yet I hadn't even considered it. Our tormentor is obsessed with Egyptology, to the point where they embalmed Lucas Hannigan. So why decapitate Graham, then hold on to his head? His fingers moved down the page. Similarly, Regis, if we are to believe that the contents of half of the canopic jars belongs to the body of Regis Hannigan, then where is his mummy? He turned his head solemnly towards the sarcophagus in the center of the room. I embalmed him myself, placed him into this sarcophagus 22 years ago. Sometime between then and now, his body has been moved. But to where? His fingers moved again. Which brings me to my next point. Sam has shared with us that he received a video of Regis as his invitation to this gathering, instead of the paper envelopes that the rest of us received. As executor of Regis's estate, I admit that I am the one who mailed out the invitations, which had been left under lock and key in a safety deposit box by Regis before his passing. However, there seems to be a 3-year discrepancy between the two. Sam's tape says the unwrapping party was to take place 25 years after Regis's death. Yet the invitations state 22. At this, Ander interrupted. Assuming Sam's video is the untampered invitation, why would someone want to move the party up 3 years? That is precisely the question, William said. His fingers slid down once more. And finally, 7. His eyes drifted up, filled with something between suspicion and pity, until they met mine. A familiar cold spread from my neck down my spine. 7 jars, which we took to mean each of us, mentioned in the letter, would have 1. But Forrest and Fawn shared theirs. The room grew even quieter as all movement stopped. Then, 4 sets of eyes turned to me. Mr. Singer, William said softly, I'm afraid you might have a jar. There was dead silence as I struggled to form words. To tell them I'd already come to the same conclusion hours ago wouldn't do me any favors. Neither would telling them that hearing someone say it out loud filled me with a dread I had never felt before. Rather than voice the emotions that were violently swirling around within me, I decided instead to make an observation. It's gone quiet. Almost in unison, the group looked confused, and then disturbed. We couldn't hear Forrest anymore. It didn't take long to get back into the dining room, but I'd already suspected what we would find. There was the chair at the end of the table, the neckties dangling loose on the armrests, the seat empty. I felt a deep, terrible feeling in the pit of my stomach. Forrest, who may or may not believe that I had murdered his sister, whose eye I had definitely gouged out, was now loose inside the large, unfamiliar house. I didn't have to wonder who was most in danger. I think I'm going to be sick, I said, clutching my stomach. Where's the bathroom? William looked at me for a moment, as though to discern whether or not I was faking. I must have been a bit green because he quickly answered, down the hall on the left. I took a lurching step towards the doorway, but then he spoke again. It's unwise for you to go alone, especially with recent developments, he said, motioning to the empty bonds. Best someone go with you. I'll go. I was surprised and a bit unnerved that it was Ander who offered to accompany me, but I wasn't feeling up to speculating in that moment, and the two of us quickly made our path down the hall. Andy was leading the way since he had been in the house before. We were approaching the turn to the left, but I had begun to overcome my shock, and the bile that had been rising in my throat had gone down. Hey, I don't think I actually need to. I was cut off by Ander yanking me to the right in a split second and pulling me down the hall. Hey, I said, my heart beating fast in my chest, but his grip didn't loosen. Was this it? Was Ander the murderer after all? He'd been normal when we first met. Maybe not normal, but he had seemed fine. But now, here he was, dragging me further into an unfamiliar house that he seemed to know so well. Was I about to die? I have something to show you. We turned into a room. It must have been a sitting room at one point, but all of the furniture was covered in large white sheets, coated in a thick layer of dust. Ander shut the door behind us, then turned to look at me. Sam, he said, seriously and quietly. Can I trust you? Startled as I was, I nodded my head. Yeah. He stared at me for a moment. Then he nodded back. He moved towards one of the sheets, under which I could see the shape of an armchair. Then he pulled something out, something that had become all too familiar of a sight. A canopic jar. You found another jar? I said, feeling an odd mixture of relief and dread. Relief because it didn't seem as though Ander wanted to kill me, and we were one jar closer to being done with the whole mess. Dread because, well, opening these jars always ended in tragedy. I mean, that's great. But why are you keeping it in here? Then I saw the face in the photograph, pasted on the front. Ander had found his own jar. I'm too afraid to open it. And I know if I show it to the others, I'll have to, he said, his hands trembling as he spoke, his bottom lip wobbling slightly before his mouth set into a hard line and his face became stern. But I also know I have to open it either way, and I think I already know what's inside. He set the jar down next to his feet. But that isn't what I wanted to show you. He bent down, reaching back under the sheet and pulled something else out. Another canopic jar. He had the back to me, but I knew for sure what it was going to be. Ander had called me into this room because he knew I had a jar. And he knew I had a jar because he had found it. There was no avoiding it now, especially since William had voiced his speculation to the group. It was time for me to learn some horrible truth about myself. My breath left my lungs shaky, and cramping nausea surged back into my abdomen. Then he turned it around. Oh, I said with surprise. It took a few steps towards him and squinted. Who is that? Ander bent his neck so he too could look at the photograph. It was a young girl, a teenager, with a bright smile and braces. Her hair was a faded blonde, and she had a small beauty mark on her chin. She was utterly and completely unfamiliar. "I think," Anders said cautiously, "this is supposed to be Wendy." Realization dawned on me. Chilling and terrible. "Then," I said slowly, "who is standing in the dining room?" When Ander and I returned to the dining room, we had only one canopic jar with us. We decided to leave Wendy's, or rather, fake Wendy's, behind for a multitude of reasons. One, although it's unlikely that Wendy is responsible for the death of Ander's father, and perhaps of Regis himself, she could still be in league with the responsible party, and exposing her could spell death for those of us left. And two, if fake Wendy didn't know that we were onto her, we were free to observe her with little suspicion. Few things had changed in the dining room since we had left it. Forrest's bonds were still hanging loose and empty on the chair at the head of the table. William and fake Wendy were standing around the wooden structure, their pietous gazes on Greta. The older woman's head was in her hands, the photograph of the cornhusk doll, the creased piece of paper, and the still-closed envelope sitting in front of her. We entered without a word, and as the three looked up at us, Ander solemnly motioned to the jar in his hands, which bore his photo. I watched fake Wendy's eyes for any sort of recognition, but couldn't catch anything. "We can do it at the same time if you'd like," Ander said to Greta, and I was surprised at the sudden kindness in his voice. The older woman hesitated, then shook her head, her eyes glazed over, not yet falling tears. "I'd rather go first. Just get it over with." Ander nodded, seeming a bit relieved. "We can do our punishments at the same time, if you don't mind." She looked hopefully up at Ander, who reluctantly grimaced. "Sounds like a plan," he said, in a lower voice. He walked around to the other side of the table and took the seat across from Greta. Once he sat, Greta picked up her folded piece of paper and began to read in a trembling voice. "Greta McIntyre, confess your sins. After your confession, open the envelope. Accept your punishment." Greta put down the paper and replaced it in her grasp with the photograph. I could see over her shoulder the image of the cornhusk doll in the dirt, its crude red smudged smile sending shivers down my back. Before I worked for Mr. Hannigan, I had a difficult life. I was 20, no parents, no prospects. I lived on the street for a time. It was hard. She said all this coldly and methodically, as though distancing herself from the emotion of her past as much as she could. She swallowed. Until I got a job at a children's home. Her finger traced the outline of the doll. It was wonderful work. I really do love children. I cooked and cleaned, and I read to the little ones before bed. But that didn't mean that all of my problems had disappeared. I had debts, and they needed to be paid. It was easy to steal from the home. They had so much trust, you see, and after working there for a few years, I was treated like family. No one was watching when I skimmed off the top of the donations. No one except Jeremy. Her hands were shaking harder now, her eyes transfixed on the doll. He had been my favorite. I taught him to make cornhusk dolls, and then he would teach the others. He wanted to help the other kids so much. I don't think he realized he was as bad off as any of them. So when he caught me stealing money, he wanted to do the right thing. He wanted to tell the other staff. I convinced him to wait. I told him that I would tell them myself, that he shouldn't worry himself with such adult matters, and then he believed me. Because he trusted me. But I knew he wasn't going to just let it go. A few tears made their way over her waterline and down her weathered cheek. I lured him out to the woods. I told him if we gathered enough twigs, I could teach him how to make another kind of doll. One that he could show the others. The children's home had an accident a few years back. A little girl wandered away from the building and into the woods. She had drowned in the lake in the center, so I led Jeremy to the bank of the lake, and she raised her hands up in front of her eyes as though unable to accept them as part of her body. She took a shaky breath, her words broken at the end by a sob. And I strangled him. That same sick feeling came back to my gut. But I fought it back down. Even though Greta's story was terrifying to hear, I was trying to keep my eye on fake Wendy. But her face betrayed nothing, save the same horror and disgust that the other faces and my own reflected. I rolled his little body into the water, and then I just left him. Greta was weeping steadily now, her breath coming in short huffs, and her voice growing thick. I waited a bit after they found his body, and decided he had drowned, just like the little girl had. And then I quit the children's home, and found work with Mr. Hannigan. She looked again to the paper in her hands, this time with incredulity. I'd gotten away with it. I never told anyone what had happened. How could they have known? It was a question that all of us had, but none could answer. There was a moment of silence. Then William spoke. And the envelope? Her hands reached for the scarlet paper. Peeling it open with long fingernails, she turned it upside down, shook it slightly, and two things fell out. One, the piece of paper with the cryptic instructions for her punishment. And two, a small, white pill. Greta read the paper first. No blow as strong as a betrayal of trust, the strength of which may take your breath away. William leaned over, peered skeptically at the pill in her hand, then his eyes widened, and he pulled away quickly. Strychnine, he said quietly. Rat poison? Andrew said with a shock. How is that a punishment? Fake Wendy asked. Won't that just kill her? I took a mental note of this comment, though I had no idea if it was significant or not. Not necessarily, William answered slowly. A small enough dose might not be lethal. Still, the effects are going to be unpleasant. Asphyxiation, for one. He reached out his hand and laid it gently on Greta's shoulder. The woman, however, pulled away. I've been running from this for decades. I deserve this. She stared at the pill in her palm, then looked up. Your turn, she said grimly to Ander. Ander paled even deeper. He looked at the jar in his hands, then raised his eyebrows and shifted his gaze to William. There's a dog on mine. Does that mean there's a puppy in this one? He let out a nervous laugh, but William didn't crack a smile. That's Dumatef, the jackal. He paused. It holds the stomach. Anders' smile dropped. His hands moved to remove the lid, which came out with a pop. Then, holding his face out of the path of wretched odor that now drifted from the opening, he stuck his arm inside the jar. The squelching sound of Anders' arm against the long dead flesh within the jar was sickening. He felt around for a few moments, his eyes shut tightly. The scarlet stood out stark against his sallow skin. Then, as more time passed and he didn't bring his arm back out, he opened his eyes and frowned. I'm not feeling anything. I felt a brief sense of relief drift back into my body. Are you sure? William asked. Reach all the way down to the bottom, maybe it's sunk, Wendy said. I took another note of this. It was as though she knew how the contents of the jars tended to behave. Like, maybe she was the one who had planted the clues in them to begin with. Anders stuck his arm in even further, and then pulled it out, the suction of it making a large slurp sound. But he didn't even flinch. I'm telling you, there's nothing in this one. There was a moment of silence. Then suddenly the tension in the room broke. Greta got up from her seat at the table, no longer crying. Here, let me try, she said, and without a moment's hesitation stuck her arm into Anders' jar. After a few moments of feeling around, she pulled it out, her hand empty. He's right. There's nothing, she said matter-of-factly, looking at William. Well, shit, William said, his scholarly air suddenly dropping. He rubbed his temples with his fingertips, then he suddenly looked at me. I'm so sorry, this never happens. I blinked. What? You know, it's a lot of props to get in order, Anders said, gesturing with his hands as he spoke, one white, one red. It makes sense that some of them get lost. Did you just say props? I started to ask, before I was interrupted. A familiar face had just entered the room, a face I had hoped I would not see again. I recoiled, stepping backwards until my leg hit hard against the chair behind me. Is someone going to give me my cue? Forrest said impatiently, re-entering the dining room. His face was still bloodied and there was rope marks around his wrists, but other than that, he looked normal. His one remaining eye wasn't bulging. His mouth wasn't foaming. What's going on? Sorry, the jar's empty, fake Wendy said, and Forrest groaned. Ugh, that sucks. Felt like we had such a good rhythm going. William let out a heavy sigh. I'll go make the call. See if they can get the stuff out to us in time, and we can pick up where we left off. He patted me on the shoulder lightly. Again, really sorry about all this. Then he left the room. We stood in silence for a few moments. I looked at Ander, the one person out of the entire group that I had grown to ever so slightly trust. I'm sorry, I started. What exactly is going on here? The props guy messed up. I forgot the stuff in my jar, Ander said simply. No, I mean, like, what are we doing here? Are we not... Is this not... I took a deep breath, feeling scared and stupid at the same time. I didn't know how to phrase the question. Fake Wendy, Greta, Forrest, and Ander all stared at me in mild confusion. Then, one by one, realization rose to their face. You do know this is fake, right? My mind was reeling. What? Ander said with a disbelieving laugh. You think this is real? Seriously, a mummy-themed horror puzzle? Don't be rude, man. He's really freaked out, fake Wendy said, looking at me with pity. You mean you didn't sign up for this? Didn't sign the waivers or anything? Greta asked. Her cold demeanor dropped as she spoke to me with concern. I only shook my head. Well, someone did it for you, I suppose. What a nasty prank. Oh, wow, Ander said, all humor gone from his face. I thought you were really into the story, or that you had some serious acting chops. You're telling me, Forrest said, gingerly pressing his fingertips to his face. He gave me a pretty sizable cut. It was tough to put on the prosthetics in between scenes. Then he stuck his fingers underneath the wound across his face and slowly and deliberately peeled it away. Beneath was healthy skin, a still working eye, and a small band-aid above his eyebrow. Panic seized me. Someone tell me what this is right now. Anders stood up from his seat at the table and walked until he was in front of me. He reached out a lanky arm, the one that wasn't coated in red, and placed it on my shoulder. I'm sorry, Sam. We thought you knew. He paused. You're the one and only participant in Regis Hannigan's immersive murder mystery experience. To say I was surprised is a bit of an understatement. But after a couple of minutes of shocked silence, a few deep breathing exercises, and falling heavily into a chair, an explanation was brought forth. To put it simply, this had all been an elaborate game. One lucky participant willingly signs up to be the main character in a horror story. The side characters are all the same, and the protagonist is always missing from the list of party invitees at the start. It's an incredibly high-budget production. And an extensive number of waivers are supposed to be filled out prior to the event because, as we've seen, there are pretty much no rules. Minor injury is permitted, and you have free range over the house. You just can't kill anyone, or leave the premises. It was the ultimate choose-your-own-adventure. You all right, man? Ander asked, squatting down so that we were eye level. Is your name even really Ander? I asked in a quiet croak. A warm smile spread softly across his face. No, but we are contractually obligated to insist that you call us by our character names. We wouldn't want to break the fiction. He laughed. I nodded hollowly. Although relief had seeped back into my bones, so did embarrassment. It was ridiculous that I had ever thought any of it was real. The sudden drop in adrenaline had made my body feel heavy, and I was officially drained. In the doorway, Forrest reached into his pocket and pulled out something small, square, and black. A walkie-talkie. He pressed the button and spoke into it. Hey, we've hit a bit of a snag down here. You might want to meet us in the dining room. At first, I had been confused as to who he was talking about, but when she arrived, it made perfect sense. Though the last time I'd seen her, I had been frantically feeling for a pulse on her wrist. There was Fawn, looking as healthy as ever. Her shirt still had a circular spread of scarlet from her puncture wound. There was no longer a fire poker protruding from her chest. What's going on? She asked the room. Nothing in my jar, Ander answered, motioning to the red mess within his container, though I was relieved to know that it most likely wasn't human organs that swam within the jar. I had no desire to ask what the substance truly was, because I know blood when I smell it. Well, that sucks, she said casually. Then she turned to me and smiled, a customer service smile. There's our special guest. You're doing really well. Better than most we've seen. How are you liking it so far? I opened my mouth slightly, faltered, and then closed it again. Forrest gave her a slight nudge and shook his head. Let's talk in the next room, he said quietly, and the two walked out. Ander must have seen the way that I had looked at Fawn because he suddenly spoke up. I suppose it's worth mentioning that Graham is fine too. He got himself a deal, so he only had to work the early shift. Beheaded, replaced with a decapitated dummy, and he's home for dinner. Lucky bastard. I nodded. Of course. There'd never been a meal of lung or a crude decapitation. Just a story that I had fallen for, wholly and completely. A few moments passed. What's taking William so long? Wendy asked with a yawn. If he plans on picking up where we left off, he's really cutting it close. I was just thinking the same thing, Greta added with a nod. I'll go check on the old man, Ander said. Want to come with me, Sam? Look like you could use the walk. Although my knees felt weak, even when sitting in the chair, I agreed. The two of us left the room in search of William. Wandering the halls with Ander felt strange, since the tone had shifted so drastically from the last time, when Andy had dragged me into the spare room and showed me fake Wendy's jar. It had been so shocking to find out that there had been a case of mistaken identity. Little did I know that everything that had happened up to that point had been a lie. It was a rubber ball under the armpit, by the way. I furrowed my brow at the shape of Ander walking in front of me. What? You were wondering why you didn't feel a pulse on Fawn? Rubber ball under the armpit does the trick. Cuts the blood flow to the wrist. Oldest trick in the book. I nodded absent-mindedly. Of course. How could it have been anything else? We passed through the parlor where the body, which I now knew to be fake, still lay underneath the sheet. Andrew, a true professional, didn't even spare it a second glance before stepping around it. I, however, hesitated. Wait. I knelt down, feeling silly as my hands trembled. Andrew watched as I peeled back the sheet. It was remarkable. I'd never seen a headless body, but I was sure the difference between this dummy and a real one were few and far between. The skin had torn so perfectly, the elasticity pulling back on itself so it bloomed like petals around the raw edge. The stump and everything that lay within it, despite being a new sight, seemed disturbingly familiar, as though the body will always recognize something that lies within itself, even if the mind cannot. Gently, I pressed a finger to the open wound. It came back red and cold. Amazingly real. Let's go. The others are waiting, Andrew said patiently. I couldn't help my incredulity, but I slowly stood up and continued with him. We walked down a few more hallways, ones I hadn't been down next. Perhaps they came later in the story, until we reached a dead end. It was remarkably difficult to find, but I supposed that was the point. They wouldn't want a customer stumbling upon a direct line to the organizers of the game, lest the spell be broken. It was a shabby-looking door to a broom closet. Andrew raised a hand and knocked on the wood. William, you got a hold of him yet? We waited, but there was no answer. Maybe he's already on his way back, I said. Takes kind of a long time to get from the dining room to here. I honestly just wanted this to be over. I was done. I wanted to be out of the house, away from the unwrapping party and these people that I had come to know and then unknow over the course of a few hours. Maybe once I was out of the madhouse, I'd be able to figure out how exactly I ended up there in the first place. Andrew turned the antique doorknob, but it didn't budge. What the hell? He said, trying to force it harder. When it still didn't give, he pressed his shoulder up against the wood and gave it a shove. William? He called out again, before once again banging against the door. Here, let me help, I said, noticing that his slight build wasn't doing very much. We lined up, facing each other. 1, 2... As we both reared back, 3! The door burst open. I saw what I feared. The image of a man, slumped down on the floor in front of an old-fashioned telephone mounted on the wall. The receiver hung low by the cord, the resonant buzzing of the dial tone, the only sound to be heard. Only the man wasn't the one I had expected. It wasn't William who lay on the floor of the closet, no. The face was unmistakable. It was Graham Willoughby. The real Graham Willoughby, I figured, since we had seen the headless doppelganger laying in the parlor moments before. His eyes were slightly open and glazed over, suggesting unconsciousness, and his chin had fallen heavily upon his chest in a bent position. Part of me was hesitant to act. Was this just a leftover stunt from before the party had gone wrong, or was this a last-ditch effort for the actors to deliver on their promise of the company? One final scare for the night. But then Andrew took a step back. I turned to look at him, and there I saw something that chilled me to the bone. For the first time, I saw what fear truly looked like on that man's face. Andrew? I said shakily, trying to keep the sound of desperation out of my tone. Andrew, is this part of it? I mean, I don't care about the game or the story, just tell me. He wasn't speaking. His mouth quivered as he stepped back again. I followed his eyes to where they were traveling, down from Graham's face and along his body. And then I noticed it. He was dressed oddly. He hadn't just changed clothes from his costume. There's something that felt strange, almost discordant. in the way that he looked. More than just the clothes. The proportions of his very being just seemed off, like a funhouse version of the man I had briefly known. He was wearing khakis and a sweater, which was an odd choice, seeing as it was a muggy July night. And that was when it hit me. He looked disturbing because his bottom didn't match his top. The detached body of Forrest Jacoby, still clothed in the outfit that matched his sister's, lay still and dead upon the floorboards, proudly wearing Graham Willoughby's head like a crown. We ran. Of course we ran. The sight of Graham's head so crudely stacked up on Forrest's fresh corpse was almost too much to bear. We took each twist and turn, fast and reckless, back to the dining room, where we could at least pretend there was safety in numbers. I blindly followed Anders' shape in front of me as we fled, still unfamiliar with the house. My eyes skated the edge of each corridor, hoping to find a path that led to an exit. But I didn't find anything. We rounded the final corner into the doorway, and as we did, I felt a sharp pain in my nose. Ander had stopped suddenly, and I was following so closely that my face slammed into his back. I felt the blood drip, warm and gentle, from my nostrils and onto my shirt, and as I started to speak, I suddenly saw the rest of the group in the dining room. Or rather, what was left of them. It was how I've always imagined the end of Hamlet, though I've never seen an actual production. An absolute slaughter. Greta was still sitting on her chair, her head laid flat against the table. There was purpling bruising swelling around her neck, and a bit of foam dripping from her mouth. The spittle crept over to the wood and wet the photograph and papers that still sit in front of her. The alleged strychnine pill from her jar was missing. Wendy was still across from her, sitting upright in her chair, not through any will of her own. Instead, as her vacant eyes looked on, the fresh bullet wound dripped from the very center of her forehead, in time with the blood from my nose. At least I thought it was a bullet wound. Letting my gaze fall behind her head, I could see what it really was. The fire poker, driven through the back of her head, through the wood of the chair, staking it in place. The tip broke through the other side, just barely exposed beneath the broken skin of her forehead. My first thought was Fawn. She was the only one that wasn't in either of the massacre rooms, and although I now knew her to merely be an actor playing a part, I still couldn't shake the image of her shooting the revolver at her brother. Maybe there was something there. Something that wasn't part of the game. But then we saw her feet. You were peeking out from the other doorway, on the far side of the dining room. "Ander," I said cautiously, nodding towards them. "I see," he answered. We both began to creep towards the other doorway. We stepped past Greta's slumped-over form, and I tried to avoid looking at Wendy, though it still felt like her eyes were following me across the room. We stepped carefully and quietly to the other side of the doorway. Fawn must have been coming back from where she and Forrest had stepped out to, and he was going to fill her in on my situation. What had happened in that brief moment that had allowed for such violent scenes to play out? Her feet had been the first thing that we'd seen, but we hadn't expected them to be the only thing. Turning the corner, we saw the bottom part of her legs, clothed in the same khaki as her brother's body, lying in the closet, with his shoes at the bottom. But above the calf, there was only a huge rectangle of wood. An overturned bookcase had fallen, volumes scattered everywhere, with Fawn's body crushed beneath. "Christ," Ander said quietly, his eyes transfixed on the pile before us. Then he quickly turned to me. "We have to get out of here. Follow me." And then we were off again, this time running away from the dining room. As we traveled, things began to look a bit more familiar. I remember some of the paintings on the walls from where I had first made my leisurely walk into the building, but it felt like lives ago. We were getting closer to our escape. I began to hear the distant hum of cicadas singing in the grass outside, and then, suddenly, Ander was gone. Some sort of force, an unseen arm, pulled him down a hallway. I was running so fast, I was a few steps past before I realized what had happened. I hate to admit it, but I hesitated. Part of me, a large part of me, Felt the animalistic urge to leave everything behind for the sake of my own safety, fight or flight. But through this entire ordeal, Ander had been sort of comforting to me. Even if he was just another liar. Even if he had been part of an experience that had been terrifying and horrific. He'd also become somewhat of a friend. This, whatever this was, neither of us had signed up for it. The hallway he'd been pulled into was dark. And though I knew I had to move quickly, I stepped slowly and cautiously into the inky blackness. "Ander?" I called out, but heard no response. There was one sound, a slight creak of the floorboards, other than that under my own feet. The creeping feeling worked its way back into me, that there was someone else there, someone very close. Something cloth was suddenly forced up against my mouth and nostrils. A sweet taste hit my tongue, and suddenly, the darkness of the hallway was replaced with a darkness of a wholly different kind. Long before my eyes knew to open, I could smell it. It was like the very worst aromas of a doctor's office, all sharp and chemically. When I did open my eyes, I couldn't see. There was a large light hanging overhead, blinding me for a moment, but after a few blinks, they adjusted, and a newfound surge of terror coursed through my body. It was one of the very worst sights one could wake up to. I was lying flat on a cold metal slab in a freezing room. The walls were lined with shelves of various jars full of pickled things that looked like they were once alive. The air had the heavy, musty feeling of the underground, and I suspected I was in a basement of some sort. I tried to sit up, but it was no use. There was a large leather strap buckled around my chest, pinning my arms down. My hands were strapped similarly to the platform I lay on. Same for my legs and feet. "Hello?" I called out, turning my head to one side, only to be met by another unwelcome sight. A metal tray full of instruments, like at the dentist's office. Only there was no brushes or plaque scrapers. Instead, there was 2 IV needles in 2 bags. One bag was deflated, empty, but the other was full to the brim with a clear solution. I suspected with dread. It wasn't water. I turned my head to the other side, but there was nothing to give me any clues, just a large curtain on a railing. There's no way to see what it was covering. Not that I was sure I wanted to. "Hello?" I called out again, more frantically. I was flashing through every horror film I'd ever seen, wondering if I had any sort of escape methods hidden in my memory, even if they were fictionalized. But there was nothing. Usually when a character wakes up in the creepy medical experiment basement, they aren't going to make it to the end of the movie. "Someone help!" I called out, though I feared that it was futile. But someone answered. "Oh, Sam, do be quiet." A face appeared over my head, framed in the bright light. It was so covered in shadow that I couldn't make it out at first, but soon as my eyes adjusted, I recognized it. A voice I had heard, and a face that I had seen only once, and never in the flesh. Leaning over me as I lay bound to the operating table was Regis Hannigan. Regis was standing over me, and I was confused. It took me a second to remember that although I had believed him to be dead for 2 decades, this was obviously not the case. That video wasn't from 1975, and it could have been recorded right before it was mailed to me. "What's going on?" I asked, my voice shaky. The old man smiled. "Well, the game's gone a bit off course, in the best way." A feeling of hope rose ever so slightly in my chest. "The game, right. This is part of it, right?" We just let out a quiet, ominous chuckle. "Sort of. My own personal game." He leaned over, and I watched his latex-gloved hand begin to fiddle with the bags of fluid on the tray beside me. "For you, I'm afraid, this is going to be very real." A shudder ran through me. I began to pull harder on my bonds, not bothering with subtlety, writhing on the cool metal. He just didn't give me a second glance, and I soon understood why. No matter how much I struggled, there was no way I had the strength to free myself. "It's about time to change your bags, eh?" the old man asked without looking at me. He held up the bag with clear liquid to the light, tapping it gently. Small air bubbles floated up to the space at the top. And I felt sick. "Don't touch me," I said, my jaw tense with fear. Regis gave me a side glance as though just reminded that I was there. "All in good time, Sam, but I wasn't speaking to you." He moved away from my body. I lifted my heavy head to track him, my neck cramping. He carried the bag to the far side of the room where the curtain concealed something unknown. He reached a withered hand out and pulled back the veil. I still can't shake the image of it. There were 2 IV stands, each holding a plastic bag like the one that Regis had carried over. One had about a half-inch of clear liquid left in it. The other was fit to burst, fat with the amount of blood that had been deposited within it. Each had a long tube cascading down, and each were connected to a limp hand, embedded with a needle. It was Ander. His eyes were half closed and vacant, staring up at the light that shone on him without squinting. He was bound, much like me, with leather straps holding him in place. Not that they needed to. He was completely unresponsive, and most notably, he was absolutely gray. Not in the metaphorical way that a character might turn gray with fear or sickness. It was as though all color had been drained from his skin. He looked like a monochromatic corpse. "Ander!" I called out. I didn't get a response. I feared the worst. Until I saw it. The smallest movement in his lips, the shape of some word I couldn't make out, as though he was trying to answer me. His eyelids fluttered as Regis took the almost empty bag off the IV stand and began hooking up the next full bag. What are you doing to him?" I called with panic. "I'm saving him," Regis answered, checking to make sure the bag was secure and then moving to the other side. He removed the bag full of blood off the stand. It was so full a line of red began to run down and drip off the bottom. Maybe save isn't the right word. Preserve. I'm preserving him. Regis put on the empty bag, and as he reattached it to the stand, the cord attached to Ander's hand pulled slightly. The unconscious young man let out a slight groan. It clicked in my mind, suddenly and terribly. The 2 IVs, the 2 bags, the awful smell of chemicals and death. Ander was being embalmed. Alive. Telling him to stop wasn't going to do any good. That much went without saying. Instead, I asked the question at the very forefront of my mind. Why? This time, Regis did look over at me. Why not? I hesitated, unsure of how to answer the question. He let out an impatient sigh. I started this business as a celebration, though much of what you learned about me and my family is fake. It is true that I am an Egyptologist. I thought I had found a way to mix together everything I loved about forgotten culture, science, and performance, to quell this urge of mine to educate the disillusioned young people that would take bait such as this, the promise of a thrill without any of the actual danger. He shook his head, but that was not enough. It was never enough to watch a fake story run its course over and over. I wanted more than anything to participate in something real. And you'll get to experience that too. His tone almost sounded as though he thought I was lucky. Well, isn't this some sort of business? I asked carefully. Won't people notice when none of your actors or your customer come back from one of your parties? At this, he gave me a full, deep laugh. How kind of you to worry about me. I assure you, Sam, I've taken every precaution when it comes to my staff. I only hire those with a limited circle of contacts. I have provided a thorough excuse for each to explain their lack of communication. He looked at me, a glimmer in his eye. And as for you, my customer, well, no one knows you're here, do they? To those in your life, it'll be as though you've just disappeared. I closed my eyes for a moment. He was right. I hadn't known about the party when I arrived, and it was clear that Regis had forged whatever forms I was meant to sign. No one at the newspaper knew where I had gone. I mustered up whatever ounce of bravery I had left within me, and said that classic and futile phrase, "You're not going to get away with this." Regis's smile widened. "Do you really think this is the first time I've done this?" He leaned over and examined Andrew's slack face. He reached a thumb and pulled up on his eyelids, revealing unresponsive pupils underneath. "I think he might finally be out. Takes a surprisingly amount of embalming fluid to kill a man, even one as scrawny as this." He paused. "I'll be able to remove the organs soon. Brain hook is my favorite." The old man made his way back to my slab. "Now we can start on you." I pulled against my bonds again as he rolled forward another IV stand from somewhere behind me. The leather was rubbing painfully against my wrists now. He hung the empty bag and connected the long tube. And then came the needle. Despite the violent shaking of my entire body, I felt the familiar bee-sting bite of a needle going into the flesh of my arm. He adjusted something. And as I watched, drops of my own blood began to fall from my vein and into the plastic. Then came the second bag. The one I feared the most. Please don't!" He ignored me. Soon the bag was hung on the second stand. "You don't have to do this!" He traced the tubing to its end and inserted it into the needle. I turned my head to look at Ander. His eyelids gave 2 more flutters. So he wasn't dead yet. I wondered if he could tell what had happened to him, or if he knew I was about to meet the same fate. The sharp point of the needle pressed against my skin. I squeezed my eyes shut. I quickly opened my eyes. The old man was no longer looming over me, and the needle was no longer aimed at my arm. Instead, a woman stood in his place, in a pose that I'd seen her in before. Greta. Spittle and blood streaming from her mouth, eyes more red than white, stood with a large piece of her canopic jar raised over her head. Greta, I said breathlessly, briefly forgetting that this was not this woman's real name. She didn't say anything as she lowered the jar and began to undo my bonds. Her hands were shaking violently and she blinked quickly. Whatever poison she had been forced to ingest hadn't been a high enough potency to kill her immediately, but it had certainly taken its toll. You have to help Ander, I said quickly. She had freed one of my hands and I started on my other arm. She turned her attention to Ander and paused at the sight of him so destitute in the slab. She stepped towards him. I'll get him, you go, she croaked, before coughing violently, gasping for air. She took the IVs out of either of his arms and started on his buckles. I quickly took out my own needle with a wince. I was so engrossed in removing my own ties, I didn't even notice that Regis had gotten up. Greta! My warning came too late. Just as the woman turned around, Regis's hand was around her neck, each fingertip pressing against the purple bruises that I had seen earlier. I suppose Regis was responsible for those too. Regis let out wild snarls and grunts as Rita tried to pry his grip from her neck. Her face turned red, then violet, as the two bashed around the room, knocking against one of Anders' IV stands and knocking it over. The bag of blood spattered on the ground like a water balloon. I finished off my last buckle. I could see that behind me was a doorway, one that undoubtedly led out of the basement and towards an escape, but I couldn't leave Ander, not like this. I was undoing his bonds as fast as I could as Regis and Greta continued to swirl around the room. Greta pushed Regis hard against the shelves on one wall, and one jar fell to the ground. The suspended creature within squelched, cold and wet onto the concrete. The last buckle. Ander was no longer bound to the slab, but he was unconscious. Ander, I said quickly, smacking the side of his sallow cheek. Ander! His eyes flushed open so slightly. Sam? We gotta go now! I helped him off the table, but his knees buckled when his feet hit the floor. We made our way towards the door, me dragging him along. There was a loud crash as Greta and Regis knocked the metal tray of tools to the ground. Regis was on top of her, and although the old woman's legs thrashed around violently, I knew there wasn't any hope. Just a little bit further, I said quietly to Ander. I stole one glance back at the two struggling on the floor just in time to see Regis reach out a hand I grabbed one of his tools. It was a long, thin metal pole with a hook on one end. It didn't take much force to plunge it through Greta's chest. She struggled for a moment, and then fell still, before Regis could turn his eyes towards Ander and I. We were gone. We had been under the house as I had suspected. I was incredibly grateful that I recognized where we were when we emerged, only one turn away from the parlor. Graham's decapitated body was still there, covered in the sheet, though of course Fawn's body wasn't. We stepped over it and we were quickly out the door. I urged Anders' tired body on and pressed him as gently and as quickly as I could into the back seat of my car. He made no sounds of protest, and I couldn't tell if this was because he understood the dire situation we're in, or if he had again fallen unconscious. Or worse. I got into the driver's seat and turned on the car. I backed down the dirt driveway without turning my head, my eyes transfixed in front of me, instead on the silhouette of the old man standing in the open doorway of that great and horrible house. My adrenaline had lasted me on the drive to the hospital, the speed of which was both unsafe and absolutely necessary. The sun was finally rising as I burst through the doors, no doubt sounding insane, as I tried to explain to anyone that would listen what exactly had happened. But once I was in the waiting room, as doctors and nurses tried to save Anders' life, I fell into a deep sleep. When I woke, it was late afternoon. My entire body ached, drained from the stress of the evening. I eyed the small bruised dot on my arm with a needle that was meant to empty me of my life force. I had once been embedded, and I shuddered. I approached the woman at the desk and asked about Ander. The guy I brought in, is he alright? I waited with bated breath for the answer. He'd looked so terrible when I had last seen him. It seemed unbelievable to think that this was something he could come back from. But to my great surprise, the woman smiled. He's perfectly fine, sweetie. He checked out a few hours ago. I blinked. That couldn't be right. Are you sure? The woman nodded. Absolutely. We stood in silence for a few moments, and I tried to unpack what she told me. Then it looked as though she suddenly remembered something. Oh, I almost forgot. She rolled her chair back and fumbled around for something in the bottom drawer of her desk. He left you this. She held out her hand, but I didn't take it. I only stared. It was a small red envelope. I drove home with it in my pocket. I went in the front door and I placed my keys on their hook. I sat in a chair at my kitchen table and I just looked at it, sitting there in the wood. Then I opened it. It was a small bit of paper. Written on it in the same font as every punishment I had read before were 4 simple words, which I read again and again and again and again and again. Thank you for playing. Hey there kids, it's me, MrCreepyPasta, and I wanted to wish you a very well, we're getting close to October. Are you as excited as I am? Also, thank you for watching tonight's video, or listening to tonight's episode of the podcast, if you're listening on Spotify. The summer is finally coming to an end, and that means we're moving into the fall. And as we get further into the fall, for those of you that live in cooler climates, you'll probably like to have a nice cup of tea. To get a nice cup of tea, my wife sells it. It's at etsy.com/shop/ivorymonocletea. You can get a whole bunch of different teas there, including creepypasta-based teas. My personal favorite is the Dark and Stormy Night, which is why you can get a sticker of me on it. If you do buy that one, you can always ask for that sticker of me doing the little dab, and you get a special dab sticker. Also, I want to give a very big thank you to all of my Patreons over there on Patreon, because you guys have helped me out quite a bit. I'm not even quite a bit. You guys are honestly, you guys pulled me out of an incredibly dark place when I first had to look at moving and all of the demon stuff that YouTube does, and thank you guys very dearly for all the help that you've given me. People like Jordan Alexander Sanchez, Bryon Arce, Bobby Karman, Stephanie Butler, Tristain Pelton, Chase Burnett, Diana Kraus, Raven Mitz, Satanic Aries, Ness69420, aisodoehtraed, Payne, Nessie, Blitzscreed, BardoHawk764, Melancholy Corpse, Ferb, Harley, Billy Morrow, Madam Skullbunny, Sashi Sazaku, @Grizzly Olsen Pro, Kayden the Spooky Boy, Zane Nightshade, My Body Sounds Like Rice Krispies, Ashwood, Lord of the Weebs, Jay, Faye Lockett, Miss Xander, Mr. Unsettling Spaghetti, Suji Campbell, Azarine Fox, Robert White, Fried Chicken 12, James Bruce, Freddy Krueger, Ty Nanny, Michael Scarborough, Infernal One, Lisa Cottrell, Caspian, Jordan Nels, Hades Nephew, Tater Chip, Acid System, Prozac and Pancake Appreciation Society, Cryptic Nightmares, Kiri the Sloth, Tommy Green, Liam Newman, Sky Harbor, Caleb Dougal, Nina Smith, Nico Kyle, Rafael Rodriguez, The Ginger Bros, Aaron Stormcrow, Daniel Polson, Trace Miles, and Corey Kenshin. Once again, thank you all so much to everyone who is in this list of names that I mispronounce, and everyone who's in the description, and everyone who supports me at patreon.com/MrCreepyPasta. I can't thank you guys enough for listening, for watching, and I wish you all sweet dreams. Good night, everyone.